This is the story of Air Transport International Flight 805. On the 15th of February 1992, an Air Transport International DC-8 freighter was on the ground at Seattle Tacoma International Airport. The plane was loaded up and took off ahead of schedule. The flight to Toledo was normal, nothing out of the ordinary. As the first officer flew the DC-8 towards Toledo, they picked up a bit of precipitation on their weather radar. It was at level 1 or 2. Nothing too bad and nothing that the pilots or the plane could not handle. The pilots up until this point in their approach had been in instrument meteorological conditions, or IMC. This meant that they had to fly the plane by the instruments and not by visual cues. But this isn't a problem on any modern airliner. At 3:12 a.m., the controller at Toledo cleared the plane to land. It was starting to get a bit stormy in the cockpit as well. The captain was not really happy with the way the first officer was flying the plane. He said things like, "If you're going to fly that slow, you're going to need more flaps. Still don't have enough flaps for the speed. Add power. You're not on the glide path. Bring it up to the glide path. You're not even on the expletive localizer at all." To say that the captain was unsatisfied with the flying of the first officer would be an understatement. A few minutes later, the captain had enough. He said, "Okay, we're going to go around. We're not anywhere near the localizer. First, let's get some terminology out of the way. Think of the localizer as the extended centerline of the runway. If you're on the localizer, it means that you're perfectly lined up with the runway. The glide slope is the proper path of descent for a plane to land on a runway. If you're on the localizer and on the glide path, it means that you're positioned correctly to land on the runway." As the pilots put Flight 805 into a climb, the controller wanted to know why the pilots were going around. The captain told the controller that they had lost the localizer in the clouds, so they were going around for attempt number 2. The controller soon had the plane on the base leg and was vectoring the pilots to intercept the ILS. The second time around, the pilots were still struggling a bit to intercept the localizer, but at 3:21 a.m., the pilots were cleared to land again. The pilots asked the controller about the surface winds. The winds at the runway were at 10 knots and at 100 degrees, but at their altitude, the winds were at 180 degrees and 35 knots. The captain did not like this at all. He said, 13 degrees of left drift. Man, they really got a bad effing situation here. Right out of the south direct effing crosswind giving you 12 degrees of drift right now. It looked like they'd have to contend with some strong winds on their way down to the runway. In the cockpit, the ground proximity warning system and the sink rate warnings went off multiple times. The first officer was riding the throttle to get the plane back on the glide path. The captain said, "Push the power and get back up to the glide path." But attempt number 2 looked like it would not work out. So this time, the captain took control of the plane and performed another go-around. But as the flaps and gear were being retracted, the plane started to bank to the left. The captain said, "What's the expletive matter here?" In the cockpit, the warnings were going off all over the place. The flight engineer was asking the captain to pull up, but the captain could not recover. Flight 805 crashed about 3 miles north-northeast of the runway. None of the 4 people on board survived, and 13 people on the ground were injured. Flight 805 had crashed on its second go-around attempt in moderately bad weather. To see how bad the weather was, the investigators talked to 2 crews who had landed in Toledo before Flight 805 had landed. The crew of ATI Flight 815 had a bit of a windy ride on their way in, and a bit of icing, but the icing wasn't so bad that the de-icing systems could not have dealt with the problem. They also talked to the crew of an Amerijet 727. They too had some light turbulence mixed in with some snow, but both planes landed safely with no issues. If they could land safely, then why couldn't Flight 805? Looking into the history of the airplane, they found that this particular DC-8 had some issues in the past. On the 13th of November 1991, this DC-8 had its main cargo door open mid-flight as it was taking off from Toledo. That incident had damaged the doors and its surrounding structures. If something like that had happened during the second go-round, it would have compromised the structure of the airplane, causing the crash. But looking at the locking mechanism for the door, they found no signs that the door had failed in flight. Moreover, had the door failed in flight, it would have definitely been picked up on the CVR. But the CVR showed no signs that the door had opened in mid-flight. In addition to that, all of the plane was at the crash site, meaning that it impacted the site in one piece. The flight data recorder on the DC-8 at the time did not record a whole lot of parameters, but the data that it did have showed a plane that was wildly out of control. The investigators came up with a few theories as to why this could have happened. The plane was carrying a heavy cylindrical metal casting. If this could have shifted in flight, then it would have messed with the center of gravity of the plane. Talking to the loadmasters, they got to know that they had loaded the cylinder in the correct way. They also couldn't find any sort of damage to the internal structure of the plane that would have been there if the casting had come free and impinged on the plane itself. But one bit of data disproved the cargo shifting theory. In the last few seconds of the plane, the first officer was starting to recover the plane from the dive. That would not have happened if the center of gravity was off. Well, at least not this fast. Another theory that they focused on was asymmetric flap extension. If the degree of extension of the flaps do not line up on both wings, that can create a very unstable situation. But the timing was off. The captain called for the flaps to be retracted at 3:24 a.m. and 30 seconds. But the first signs of issues only showed up 1 minute and 9 seconds later. A flap issue would have manifested itself much sooner, like 6 to 10 seconds after the flaps had been raised. So, that wasn't the issue. They also looked at the things like asymmetric engine thrust. Analysis of the audio from the CVR proved that all engines were operating as usual up until impact. This led the investigators to consider spatial disorientation. The flight data showed that the plane was in a bank that got slowly worse. If the captain was disoriented, then it would be possible that he could have put the plane into a steep bank without even knowing that he was doing it. Right before he lost control, the captain had put the plane into a slight descent because he overshot his assigned altitude of 3,000 feet by 211 feet. This combination of steady turn acceleration to deceleration changeover can cause disorientation in many pilots. Medical experts noted that deceleration while turning can produce a sensation of turning in the opposite direction. So, if the captain believed that he was rolling out of his roll to the left, then it made sense why he would keep adding control inputs to the left. He thought he was turning in the opposite direction. With no or very little visual cues outside, it made it very hard for the captain to gauge what his plane was doing. But that's not the full story. The captain was very well experienced, and he was well reviewed by his peers. What could cause him to fall prey to a spatial disorientation? The investigators looked at the ATI, or the Attitude Director Indicator. If the ATI malfunctioned, it would explain why the captain did what he did. It was kind of his only window to the outside world. Digging through the history of the plane, they could not find any issues with the Honeywell ATI. They even went through the documents by SAS, the previous owner of this DC-8. They found no issues there. Moreover, if the system detected a difference between two ATIs, then there would be a warning and an audible click. But the investigators did not find that audible click on the CVR. But there was a failure mode where the ATI would freeze up, and if that happened, the failure would be a lot more subtle. But the recovered ATIs were so badly damaged that they couldn't say for sure that the ATIs had malfunctioned. But as per the investigators, it is something that would have made a lot of sense. But even if the ATI on the captain's side had malfunctioned, it wasn't the end. They could have gotten good information from the backup ATI or even the first officer's ATI. So when the captain knew that things were slipping away, he handed the plane back to the first officer. The first officer's recovery attempts seemed to be working, which meant that he was getting accurate pitch data from the ATI. So why wasn't the first officer able to recover the plane if he knew what was going on with the plane? When the first officer said, "I got it," the angle of bank was 80 degrees. He immediately got to work leveling the wings, which is what he was supposed to do. Then once he got the wings somewhat level, he started to arrest the descent of the plane. The sad thing was that even though he was doing the right things, he was not aggressive enough. This comes down to the attitudes that commercial pilots are imbibed with in their training. Commercial pilots, at least back then, were not given a lot of training in recovering from unusual attitudes, because you wouldn't have to recover from an unusual attitude if you did not get into an unusual attitude in the first place. Even maneuvers attempted by airline pilots are much less aggressive than military or acrobatic pilots. The first officer could have saved the plane if he had challenged the captain's overbank 10 seconds earlier. He might have been hesitant to do that because of his poor performance earlier on in the flight. The thing is, even if the first officer had been more aggressive with his inputs, he might have been able to save the plane. The thing is, the first officer left performance on the table. The first officer's pullout was within the performance envelope of the plane, and even if he had went over the limits of the plane, there would have been some leeway before the plane started to fall apart. In such a life or death situation, it would have been appropriate to give it your all to save the plane. Why do you think the captain lost control of the plane? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It will really help the channel grow. I will catch you guys next time. Stay safe.